Today, I'd like to talk a little bit about sensation, perception, and the social construction of reality. The process through which sensation, which is the bringing in of information from the world outside of us, is a starting point for having an understanding of the social world, but as we'll see over the course of this lecture, and more broadly in this part of the semester, that's really only the beginning. For background, I'd like to say a couple quick things about social constructs and the nature of social construction in the field of sociology. It's actually been around. The concept has been around for quite a long time. Back in the 1920s, a researcher at the University of Chicago named William Thomas very famously studied immigrants coming into the city of Chicago, and he was really struck by the way in which somebody who had acquired a set of cultural resources like symbols and language and values and norms and beliefs in another place came to a new place and tried to navigate their everyday social life in this new place, often using the resources that they had developed to navigate an entirely different kind of society. And he was really interested in the way in which people sort of managed that process. And out of this comes what we've come to call the Thomas theorem, or definition of the situation. And in 1927, he writes a piece on Polish immigrants in Chicago. And in that piece, there's a quote where he writes, if men define situations as real, they are real in their consequences. Now, we can obviously update that to say if people define situations as real, they are real in their consequences. What he's saying here is that perception is the thing that is going to guide our behaviors. So our understanding of the world around us, not the world itself, but our understanding of the world is going to guide how we approach and make sense of our experiences in that world, how we strategize, how we coordinate with others. I have a former dean who's very fond of saying perception is reality. And with all due respect to this former dean, I would say that there's a fundamental flaw in that claim. Right? Reality is reality, and I want to be absolutely clear on that. I might perceive that I am able to fly, but if I jump off the roof of a building, gravity is going to remind me very quickly that that is not the case. Right? So reality is reality, but if I believe I can fly, then I may very well jump off a roof, right? So that's not changing reality. It is my actions are guided by what I understand reality to be. That's a different thing, right? Our understandings don't alter reality. Reality remains reality. But here's the thing. There is, and I'm perfectly willing to stipulate to this, there is an external material world that surrounds us. And it has significant influence on the lives of the people who live under those material conditions. The problem with the external world is sort of twofold. The first is that we have to stipulate that it exists. We have to agree that it exists because we can't really independently verify that it exists, right? There's no way to establish with certainty the existence of an outside world, right, outside of us, without pointing to our experiences of that world, right? So it's automatically, right, that there's a level of remove between our experiences of the world and the world itself, right? Because the world itself is going to be filtered through the tools that we have to make and generate understandings of it. So that's the first problem. The second problem is that the use of these tools is going to distort the nature of that external world, right? So we can't independently verify that it exists without pointing to our own experiences of it, and our own experiences of it are going to be biased by the cultural resources that we use to make sense of it. So whatever it is that is outside of us is consequential, but I can't prove that we are, that we're not in the matrix, for example. How would we know, right? That's the problem, that we're pointing to our own experiences of the world and saying that that's evidence that that world exists. But our experiences can obviously be biased and distorted. So we'll just agree, I hope, we will agree that there's a material world that exists outside of us. And we're going to have to just accept that. And the second thing we'll need to accept is that our understanding of that external world, that material world, is going to be filtered through the cultural resources we use to generate an understanding of it. And that is inevitably going to create a biased or somewhat distorted perception of the world that exists outside of us. So sensation is the process through which the information comes into our awareness. Perception is the understanding that is formed of those experiences. And that process through which sensation becomes perception is one that's profoundly guided by language and symbols. And certainly to an extent by things like values and beliefs as well. So there are kind of a couple of processes that are going on here, right? So the first is categorization, right? So this is the process of placing items into classes, and items here would be experiences of the external world. So information about the world outside of us comes into our awareness through one or more of our five senses, right? So we got sight, sound, taste, touch, smell. That's how all of that information comes into our awareness. Now, when we have a sensation of something in the world around us, say light reflecting off of an object and striking our retina, those nerve impulses will travel up into our brains where internal cognitive processes will organize and shape our understanding of that wavelength of light. The primary consequence of that is the identification of a color, or perhaps a shape, right? A label for the object that we're observing, that is being sort of brought into our awareness through our sense of sight. So categorization is this first step, right? So it's a social psychological activity involving what Zerubbabel, who's a social psychologist, Zerubbabel calls lumping and splitting. Lumping is when we cluster things together based on some agreed upon similarity. Splitting is what we do when we differentiate objects from one another. The categories into which we organize these objects is somewhat arbitrary, right? There's no rule in the material world that says we have to cluster certain things together and then call them a certain thing. It's a convention of culture. It's something that we've decided collectively to do. Zerubbabel describes this as a process of carving the world into islands of meaning, right? So things that ultimately have meaning for us, that we understand based on our shared sort of labeling and categorization. The second part of this process is conceptualization. Conceptualization is the process of forming an idea of something. So categorization, putting things into classes. Conceptualization is essentially attaching meaning to those things, right? So what is it and what does it mean to us? Now there's a video you're going to watch on color perception and the role of culture in shaping how and under what conditions color is socially constructed. That's not to say that wavelengths of light don't exist. They absolutely exist. But wavelengths of light and color are not the same thing. Color is the label that we attach to the particular experience we have of a specific wavelength of light. And when we look at people who share a culture, right? People who use the same general set of resources to engage in that process of categorization and conceptualization, they're going to perceive the same colors. People from cultures that use very different resources to engage in the same process are going to have very different colors. They're going to lump and split in a way that's specific to their culture, but could be very distinct from somebody else's culture. So when you watch that video, keep some of these concepts in mind. The thing that I'd like to focus on to sort of bring it back to this whole notion of a socially constructed reality, a shared version of that external world, is something we call intersubjectivity, and this is where I'm going to kind of spend the next couple of minutes, and then we'll wrap this up. So when we experience as individuals, right, as individual organisms, when we experience the external world, we're experiencing that external world subjectively. That means as individual, separate, and distinct organisms. So when light strikes my retina, or when tastes interact with my taste buds, or sound waves, right, compressions of atmosphere strike my tympanic membrane, those are all experiences that I'm having. Nobody else is seeing anything through my eyes, tasting anything with my mouth, or hearing anything with my ears, right? So I'm having a subjective experience of that external world. And somebody in my society, somebody in my community is also having a subjective experience of that outside world. But when we, as two separate organisms, smell something and we turn to each other and say, "Do you smell that?" And that smells like barbecue, right? So we both identify a particular sensory experience in the same way, even though we're having two separate sensory experiences. Now, a lot of people assume the reason why we have the same perception is we're having the same experience. But it's a little bit more sophisticated than that. The reason we're having the same perception is that we're using the same cultural resources, symbols and language, to make sense of the external subjective experience that each of us is having individually. So there are rules, right? There are rules that tell us how to organize those experiences, what to label them, how to feel about them, right? And the similarity of perception is a function of that, and not the fact that it's materially the same thing that's happening in the world outside of us, and we're both just experiencing it individually. So each of us has an individual subjective experience of the world, but because we're using the same resources, my subjective experience and my friend's subjective experience actually overlap quite a bit, right? If you would imagine a Venn diagram, right, two overlapping circles, they're never going to be perfectly aligned because I'm a separate organism. I am a distinct individual, and I'm not this other person, and I don't share any of my sensory organs with them, and they don't share any of their sensory organs with me, and we certainly don't share any of our brain or mind. But again, mostly those two circles overlap, and it's the area in the overlap that is the shared experience. And the shared experience again comes from the fact that we're using these shared cultural resources. We call that experience an intersubjective experience. So again, I-N-T-E-R, I've probably mentioned this before. Anytime you see a word that starts I-N-T-E-R, that means between. So the intersubjective experience is the degree to which the subjective experiences that each of us is having individually is kind of shared in some way, right? So it's a kind of a shared meaning that we use as just kind of an everyday resource, right? It's just something we do all the time in order to interpret the meaning of elements of social and cultural life. So when we walk through the world and we're experiencing things, my subjective experience and my friend's subjective experience are mostly the same, and we can talk meaningfully about the thing that's happening in the world around us, and we can coordinate a response to it. This becomes harder to do as the two people involved in this process share less and less of the cultural resources they use to take that perception or that sensation and turn it into perception. So intersubjectivity is what allows us to create a shared interpretation or a shared perception of that external world. And that external world is then what we call a socially constructed reality, right? Because it's gone through the process of social construction. So in class, we're going to talk a little bit about this in some detail, and I'm going to give you guys some fun little examples and illustrations of these concepts, as well as some of the ones I'm going to talk about in the next video. But that should get us on our way to understanding what I will admit is a kind of conceptually challenging and maybe a little bit of a difficult concept to immediately grasp. So, read the chapter, read the supplemental readings, ask a lot of questions, watch the lecture video as often as you need to. And if there's, again, if there's anything that you don't understand or you need additional clarification on, by all means, reach out and let me know, and I'd be happy to help. So in the meantime, take care, and I'll talk to you next time.